The water in front of this view has not changed its outline in 16 centuries, but almost nothing else here has stayed the same. Picture the frame as it exists today. Stone underfoot, a domed church crowned in gold mosaic, catching the light. A palace of pink and white marble beside it. A bell tower standing over the whole scene, like a needle driven into the sky. Boats crossing constantly in the basin beyond. Now let that entire arrangement dissolve. The crowds thin first. Then the motorized boats vanish from the water. Then electric light fades from the windows. Then the stone paving itself softens back into packed earth and timber landings. The bell tower sinks downward and disappears completely. The palace loses its Gothic arcades, then its upper stories, then stands only as a modest fortified compound. The great domed church shrinks into a smaller, plainer predecessor, and then that too disappears. What remains is simply a lagoon. Shallow water, reed beds, low unstable islands, and mudflats exposed at low tide. Sometime in the 5th and 6th centuries, people who had spent generations on the nearby mainland began looking at this unpromising ground and seeing something the open countryside no longer offered, which was safety. Repeated invasions and the collapse of stable authority on the mainland made a home built on water, difficult to reach and easy to defend, worth the discomfort of living on it. The earliest arrivals drove wooden piles into the mud to create surfaces firm enough to build on, a technique that would define construction here for 1,000 years. Huts, jetties, and small landings appeared where, before, there had been only water and reed. None of this was glamorous. It was survival architecture, built by people who fished the shallows, ferried goods by small boat, and gradually discovered that what had begun as a temporary refuge was becoming a permanent home. The lagoon that once repelled settlement now began, slowly, to reward it. As the mainland's instability persisted across the 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries, these separate island communities faced a new problem: proximity without connection. A settlement scattered across dozens of low islands could defend itself, but it could not easily govern itself, trade efficiently, or project any unified strength. So the channels between islands, once simply obstacles, began to be treated as streets. Landings grew more substantial. Waterfront edges were reinforced with timber and eventually stone, and boat traffic intensified into something resembling urban circulation rather than isolated fishing trips. Political authority consolidated around an early governing structure near this waterfront. The first ancestor of what would later become the seat of the Venetian state, while a modest religious complex took shape nearby. Nothing like the building that would eventually dominate this view, but enough to mark the site as a center rather than a periphery. Trade with the Byzantine world to the east, still the dominant power in the region, gave these lagoon merchants something the mainland could not: a source of wealth independent of agricultural land. Every additional cargo that arrived by water reinforced the same lesson, that this city's fortune would be built on movement rather than territory. By the close of the 10th century, the scattered refuge of earlier generations had become something that could reasonably be called a city, connected by canals instead of roads, its economy running on ships instead of fields. That wealth, once it began accumulating, needed somewhere to be expressed, and building in wood could not carry that expression the way stone could. In the 11th century, the modest religious structure at the heart of this waterfront was pulled down and rebuilt at a scale and richness the lagoon had never seen. Drawing heavily on Byzantine architectural language, domes rising above the rooftops for the first time, and mosaic and marble beginning to accumulate on its surfaces over the following generations. This rebuilding mattered for reasons beyond religious devotion. A city that had spent centuries proving it could survive was now using architecture to prove it could compete, matching the visual authority of empires far larger than itself, with a building constructed by merchants and sailors on reclaimed mud, deepening trade connections across the Mediterranean, including growing involvement in the political and commercial currents of the crusading era, brought both goods and imported craftsmanship into the city, visible in the layered richness accumulating on the church's exterior over the following 2 centuries. Political authority followed the same trajectory. The modest governing compound beside the waterfront began expanding as the city's ambitions expanded with it. And by the 12th and 13th centuries, a genuinely wealthy and increasingly confident maritime power required a seat of government that looked the part. The turning point came after the early 13th century, when a major redirection of a crusading expedition brought enormous wealth and strategic advantage flowing back into this city, accelerating a transformation already underway. Over the following 2 centuries, the modest civic compound was rebuilt into a sprawling structure in the Gothic style, then fashionable across the region. Its stone arcades and pointed arches replacing the old fortified simplicity, while beside it a bell tower climbed steadily upward until it dominated every other structure in view, becoming the fixed point by which sailors could locate the city from far out on open water. This was the moment the lagoon settlement became unmistakably an imperial capital. The waterfront itself was formalized into a ceremonial landing, built to receive fleets, ambassadors, and the material wealth of a trading network stretching from the eastern Mediterranean to northern Europe. Density increased sharply as the population needed to staff this expanding maritime empire, crowded into the city's limited land, and the skyline that had once consisted of scattered wooden structures now presented domes, a soaring tower, and an increasingly ornate civic palace as the visible proof of a power that stretched far beyond what the eye could see from this single vantage point. By the middle of the 15th century, the city had, in a real sense, finished building the skyline that would define it for the rest of its history. And the challenge facing the following century was not how to grow further, but how to refine what already existed. The artistic currents of the Renaissance, spreading outward from the Italian mainland, entered this saturated urban fabric, not by clearing it away, but by layering new facades and ornament onto structures that had stood for generations. A habit of building on top of the past rather than erasing it that would define the city's architecture for centuries to come. Diplomats, artists, and merchants from across Europe treated this waterfront as a destination in its own right. And the polish applied to its buildings during this period reflected a republic that had stopped needing to prove its power and had started wanting to display its taste. That accumulated density and wealth, however, carried its own risk. Crowded wooden interiors, closely packed neighborhoods, and the general hazards of a pre-modern city made catastrophe, when it came, especially costly. Fires and outbreaks of plague, across the later 16th and 17th centuries, damaged sections of the built environment and disrupted the rhythms of daily and commercial life, forcing periods of repair and reconstruction that layered Baroque additions onto a city already built from Byzantine, Gothic, and Renaissance components. Crucially, the great civic and religious landmarks anchoring this frame survived, these episodes largely intact, meaning that each disaster added another architectural layer to the city, rather than erasing what had come before. The lesson repeated throughout this period was a simple one. Destruction here rarely meant disappearance, because a city with this much invested in its landmarks tended to repair rather than abandon them, and each recovery left the skyline slightly more complex than it had been before the damage occurred. By the 18th century, the buildings framing this view had largely stopped changing in any major way, because the empire that had funded their construction was no longer expanding the way it once had. Shifting global trade routes, particularly the opening of new oceanic paths to Asia that bypassed the Mediterranean entirely, gradually reduced this city's central role in international commerce. Yet the frame did not become static, because a completed city can still change through what happens inside it, rather than what gets built on top of it. The waterfront filled increasingly with civilian and ceremonial life, rather than the outward-facing naval and mercantile activity of earlier centuries. Gondoliers and festival crowds replacing something of the urgency that had once defined this place as a working imperial capital. This shift in atmosphere, from expanding power to inherited grandeur, made what happened next feel especially abrupt. In 1797, the republic that had governed this city for over 1,000 years, one of the longest-lived independent states in European history, collapsed within weeks under external pressure. Its ancient political institutions dissolved almost overnight. Foreign administrations followed in succession over the following decades, altering flags, symbols, and the formal functions of the buildings in this frame, yet leaving the physical architecture itself almost entirely untouched. It was a striking demonstration that a political order and the built environment it leaves behind do not necessarily disappear together. The palace, the church, and the tower that had defined this skyline for centuries continued to stand, indifferent to which government claimed authority over them, even as the world that had originally built them had ceased to exist. The following century brought a transformation, driven not by conquest but by technology, as steam power and eventually motorized transport began reshaping how people and goods move through this waterfront, gradually crowding out the sailing vessels that had defined water traffic here for well over 1,000 years. Integration into a larger national and international transportation network drew growing numbers of visitors to a city whose primary economic identity was shifting from maritime trade towards something closer to living monument, an early form of the tourism that would eventually come to dominate its economy entirely. Then, in 1902, the tall bell tower that had anchored this skyline since the medieval period and had stood as the single most recognizable vertical element in this entire view for roughly 600 years, collapsed into rubble. Structural fatigue accumulated over centuries had finally overwhelmed the tower's foundations, and it came down with enough warning that no lives were lost. But the sudden absence from the skyline was unmistakable to anyone who had known the view before. Rather than leave the gap, the city committed to reconstructing the tower exactly as it had stood, and by 1912, a rebuilt structure, visually identical to its predecessor, once again dominated the frame, restoring the skyline's familiar silhouette. The episode captured something essential about how this city had always responded to loss, not by accepting a permanently altered frame, but by insisting on continuity, even when it meant painstakingly reproducing what had been destroyed. Around the rebuilt tower, the water traffic below continued its steady modernization. Motorized ferries and service boats, increasingly sharing space with the traditional craft that had never entirely disappeared. While 2 world wars passed through the wider region during these decades without fundamentally altering the architectures standing in this frame. In the decades following the middle of the 20th century, the transformation visible from this vantage point became less about construction and more about intensity. Growing global mobility and the rise of mass tourism turned this waterfront into one of the most visited urban landscapes on Earth. The water below now dominated by motorized water buses, service vessels, and boats built specifically to move visitors rather than cargo or passengers in the older sense. The city's economy reoriented itself substantially around the preservation and presentation of what earlier centuries had built, meaning that conservation, restoration, and careful management of the historic fabric became as central to the city's survival as trade once had been. Environmental pressures, including periodic flooding that had always been part of life on a lagoon, but grew more frequent and severe over these decades, added a new layer of urgency to the work of keeping these centuries-old structures standing. And yet, remarkably, the essential elements framing this view, the domed church, the Gothic palace beside it, the reconstructed tower rising above both, remained recognizably the same buildings that had defined this skyline since the medieval and early modern periods. What had changed almost entirely was the rhythm and density of movement across the waters, and along the stone edge in the foreground, civilian life and global visitation replacing the naval fleets and merchant convoys of earlier centuries. By the time this frame reaches the present day, in the year 2026, it holds within it the accumulated evidence of every phase this place has passed through. Piles driven into mud by people seeking refuge, a religious complex rebuilt to rival empires, a civic palace expanded to house a maritime state, a tower that fell and was deliberately restored, a republic that vanished while its buildings remained standing, and a modern world that arrives here now by the millions, drawn to a view that has been continuously inhabited, continuously rebuilt, and continuously preserved for 1,600 years. The land beneath this frame barely moved. The water in front of it never stopped being water. Everything else here is simply what successive generations chose to build, lose, and rebuild between them, layer upon layer, until an unstable stretch of lagoon became one of the most enduring urban landscapes the world has ever produced.